We now have five who voted for Donalds. That means that on this roll call, at least McCarthy will not, most likely will not get the Speaker's gavel. Garrett Haake, let's also catch up on a couple of people who have moved into what would be the Speaker's office. Roy Donalds and Andrea, Scott Perry. Do we know anything about what's up?
Not the Speaker's office, Andrea. So what's happened here, the minute this vote got underway, several of the members of that anti-McCarthy faction hightailed it off the floor. Chip Roy, Scott Perry, Byron Donalds, himself the nominee for Speaker, followed shortly thereafter by Dan Bishop, who had just introduced Byron Donalds, and Lauren Boebert. They're not talking, but they have all ended up in another office that's being used for some of these negotiations, about downstairs, about 100 yards away from where I'm standing right now, with some of the McCarthy allies like French Hill, other Republican members who've been trying to kind of midwife these negotiations between McCarthy and his opponents. And I think it's noteworthy that for the first time in as many days as we've been covering this, none of those folks were talking. They were very tight-lipped on the way out. A lot of no comments, a lot of we're just going to keep talking. This is a situation in which the absence of new information suggests to me a certain amount of activity here. We knew going into this vote, Kevin McCarthy told me on the way to the floor, told other reporters, no expectation that the vote totals here will change. But the fact that people are having these closed-door meetings now and clamming up in public is typically a signal that something is actually noteworthy of afoot. And we've got more work to do as reporters to figure out what.
And I know you're all over this. Thank you so much, Garrett Haake. Steve Kornacki, let's catch up with the vote count. This is the 7th. And we know that something is beginning to shift, certainly with the agenda vote yesterday, what was referred to by John James in his nominating speech of McCarthy as a small victory, their first victory. They won 216 to 214 last night, a signal that maybe there was some give among McCarthy supporters and some of the 20 who were refusing to go along.
Well, yeah, real interesting to hear what Garrett is describing there, the potential activity, and very curious to see what, if anything, shakes out there. But, yeah, as you can see, form is holding. We just track on every vote. The folks who have voted against McCarthy on previous ballots, how are they voting as they go through this roll call? And you can see right now they all continue to vote against McCarthy for Donalds. Alphabetically, Donalds, the next name to be called. Sounds like from Garrett's reporting he may not cast a vote right away. They might come around to him at the end. Curious, though, to hear Donalds has been voting for himself. Will he continue voting for himself in this round? And again, you just look down the list. These are all the names to come alphabetically here. Is there going to be anybody on this ballot who switches over to McCarthy? It's academic at this point in the sense that he's not going to be settled on the 7th ballot. This will go to an 8th ballot. But would there be any budge toward McCarthy as these later names are called? Also, are there going to be any peel-offs from McCarthy? We haven't heard any of those yet. One name that was called early, Ken Buck of Colorado, who'd been sending some public signals that maybe he was through voting for McCarthy. He did vote for McCarthy. So you take a look at this list. We'll see what is to come from it. But you mentioned that motion to adjourn last night that got them out last night. It was a win for McCarthy, but if some kind of a deal with some of these renegade faction does emerge, keep in mind there were still 4 Republicans who voted against that motion to adjourn last night. That was Andy Biggs, Lauren Boebert, Eli Crane, and Matt Gaetz. 4. Even if McCarthy strikes a deal with a lot of these renegades here, 4 is the maximum number of Republicans he can afford voting for somebody else. And there were 4 who wouldn't even vote to adjourn last night. And you see, they just make the top of this list. There are other names on this list, too, like Bob Good, who's been sending public signals that he doesn't think he could ever support Kevin McCarthy. So, again, even if there's some kind of a deal that moves a significant number of these Republicans into McCarthy's camp, anything more than 4 voting for a non-McCarthy candidate on a future ballot, he still won't have the votes.
Yeah, he's got a big cliff to climb, especially Matt Gaetz and others, as you point out, have said they would never vote for McCarthy, so they're not going to switch. I want to bring in Yamiche Alcindor here with me because we've been talking about what kind of concessions are being made here, Yamiche, and some of them are really big, like the motion to vacate. That's what brought down John Boehner. And then it was, now it's been down to one He's conceded that it is only one that can bring up a motion. As Garrett was saying earlier, this could be the third motion after the pledge and the prayer each day, a motion to vacate. Something that Nancy Pelosi got rid of after seeing what happened to her predecessor, John Boehner.
It's certainly, I think, fascinating to watch Kevin McCarthy appear to lose the seventh ballot here because, as you just said, he made those concessions, Andrea. He talked about the fact that he was going to go and talk to these conservative members who didn't want to be part of the people who were supporting him initially. I think it's something to say that Kevin McCarthy last night was telling reporters, I crawl before I walk before I run, saying really that this is a mountain that he's climbing, and he might be on his knees at the beginning, but he's hoping at some point to get on his feet and be at the top of that mountain. But it just is still hard to understand how he gets to the number where he doesn't lose for Republicans, because this seems to be so personal. I've been asking sources, asking Republicans all this week, what is really at the heart of this? Is it policy? Is it rules change? Or is it just personal animosity? And my reporting suggests that people just don't trust Kevin McCarthy for the people who are staunch opponents of his. And that's going to be a really, really hard thing for Kevin McCarthy to deal with. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how this turns out. But the fact that he's making concessions, that he's continuing to say, I'll give you more and more, and that's not working, it doesn't bode well for him.
And David Jolly joining us as well, former Republican Congress member. I just have been told that Matt Gaetz stood up and voted for Donald Trump. So that gives you a sense of the flavor of some of these rebels. Trump, who had really shown his own weakness by not being able to put Kevin McCarthy, over the top on day one or day two. He seemed to be ignored, especially by Lauren Boebert in one of her floor speeches last night. David Jolly, what is your read on your former Republican colleagues and what this all means in terms of the concessions that have already been made and how that will affect McCarthy or any other future speaker in this caucus?
Yeah. So not just the concessions on the rules that you've talked about, but Kevin McCarthy is pulling out all the stops, having Donald Trump weigh in, frankly, having his allies at Fox News, having one of the largest PACs in the country that he's affiliated with make concessions. He has unleashed all the pressure on these members, but they're not moving. And Andrea, this is an interesting vote right now because McCarthy needs to show some movement here, or we're all going to start to ask the question, is he really telling the truth when he says progress is being made? The theme of the last 18 hours was we're making progress. He needs to demonstrate that on this vote. It was telling that they didn't offer a motion to adjourn right away. If they really needed more time to talk, he could have had cooperation among the current 20 to say, let's keep talking, let's adjourn and keep talking. Instead, they did go to this vote. There's a lot on the line for McCarthy. Maybe he shows progress, maybe he doesn't. But to Yamisha's point, he can roll back some of the 20 who are voting against him, but it doesn't matter if he can't roll back the 5 Never Kevins. And in this lane, I think the Never Kevins are going to start to have to share more with the country that it's not just about the rules, that in fact they don't trust Kevin. And Yamiche is exactly right. The issue is trust. They don't trust Kevin McCarthy. And Ken Buck alluded to that and said, even if you change the rules, we don't trust Kevin McCarthy to not waive those rules down the line. Kevin McCarthy has a long ways to go. Maybe he chips away a little bit here, but if he's not chipping away at the 5 to 6 true hard no never Kevins, there's still no pathway for Kevin McCarthy. I think he ultimately is going to have to withdraw. It's just a question of timing.
And if he were to withdraw and they do go to an alternate candidate, a consensus candidate, even if such a person exists, would that candidate really be constrained by the deals that McCarthy has already offered? Does that become the new baseline?
Clearly, I mean, it's hard for if the deal is just done within the Republican caucus, which I think would have to be right now. We're not at the break glass scenario. Then most of these concessions would have to stay on the table. Here's the most critical thing if there is another candidate. The way it has to happen is the following. It cannot just be that Kevin McCarthy withdraws and there's no candidate, and then they spend 2 weeks fighting over who that candidate is. What Kevin McCarthy can do is what Boehner did for Paul Ryan, which is the deal that he could strike today, Kevin McCarthy, is to work out with all of these rebels who is the candidate that gets to 218, so that if I, Kevin McCarthy, am going to withdraw, we immediately move to a vote as a unified caucus and anoint whoever that speaker is. I don't know that there is somebody right now that could get 218. That's why that is a real deal that would have to be struck.
It is such a dilemma for the Republican caucus. They look weak. The former president looks weak. Let's bring in NBC News chief White House correspondent and Weekend Today co-host Kristen Welker. Donald Trump got a vote from Matt Gaetz.
Well, Andrea, it tells you all you need to know, I think, about the various different threads that we are watching as this extraordinary moment unfolds. Here you have Matt Gaetz, a McCarthy detractor, saying that he supports former President Donald Trump, underscoring that Mr. Trump still has a wide swath of support among the Republican base. And yet, Andrea, this moment also highlighting the fact that support may be limited, may be starting to wane a little bit. He has publicly called for Republicans to get behind McCarthy, saying, let's get on with it. He wants to be focused on the fact that Republicans have won the House, have taken back the House. We know that he's been reaching out directly to some of these Republicans, including Lauren Boebert, who publicly stated that despite that outreach, she still will not back McCarthy. And so you're really seeing these conflicting threads as it relates to the former president, who has announced that he is running for re-election. And of course, it comes against the backdrop of the current commander-in-chief, Andrea, trying to make that final decision about whether he'll announce.